Bordeaux in southern France, when they make wine there today, you know, Bordeaux. But the Frankish army is standing in the field because they don't fight on horseback in Europe. They haven't learned how to do that. And they're holding these big heavy metal swords that take two hands because they don't have the technology for the scimitar. And in one pass, the Muslim cavalry annihilates the Frankish army. Right? I mean, here's these, you know, 80,000 guys charging, the ground's rumbling, and these guys are all standing there on their foot while these horses go. In one pass, they're all dead. They're unstoppable. So Pope Gregory puts out a plea that anybody that could fight should join Charles Martel. Charles Martel is the grandfather of Charlemagne. Charles Martel is in France, and he is able to get 30,000 volunteers. These are guys just off the farm. They're dressed with their animal pelts and their axes, and they're all on foot. They don't know how to fight on horseback yet. And he gathers in tours about 170 miles from Paris. And the Muslims, Abdul Rahman was their commander. They're filling the valley with tens of thousands of these Muslim soldiers. And so the next morning, the Muslims look up the hill and they see Charles Martel's men up there, but from their vantage point, it just looks like another line. And so they're just going to charge right through it like they always do. And they're charging up hills and they charge into the line. Well, it wasn't a line. It was 30,000 guys in one block, one square. They charge in there and they get stuck and then they end up getting killed. Meanwhile, Charles Martel had prearranged for some of his men to sneak into the Muslim camp and free the captives. And you see, Muhammad said you can have 4 wives plus as many as your right hand possesses, and so you could come away from battle with a lot of extra women. And then the Sultan always got a 5th. That was Muhammad's portion of the booty. Many sultans had 1,000 wives. One sultan had 12,000 wives. Anyway, as these warriors are fighting, and they see the booty being let go from their camp by these spies, these warriors begin to slip away from the fight and go back and protect their stuff. And the commander, Abdul Rahman, starts seeing his guys leaving, and he gets upset, and he's trying to yell at them, rally them to come back, and he gets distracted, he gets surrounded, he gets killed. And now the Muslim warriors can't decide who their next commander was going to be, and they just pick up and they go back to Spain. That was the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. The Muslims went from the tents of Arabia to outside of Paris in just 100 years, and it was all through military conquest and through intrigue, like, you know, if you don't join us, we'll kill you. And so this was a very important battle, because if Charles Martel would have not stopped the Muslim invasion, you and I would be speaking Arabic right now, because German, French, and English would have never developed as languages. We would be like Egypt, where the Egyptian language is no longer spoken, except of some Coptic churches up in the mountains. And so Charles Martel got every horse he could find, and the donkeys were the animal that people would ride because it was a more comfortable ride, so people didn't ride the horses. But once they invented the stirrup, they realized, hey, this is a military weapon. And so Charles Martel got every horse he could find, learned how to make the stirrup, and taught his men how to fight on horseback. And 5 years later, Charles Martel won his first battle, Charles the Hammer. And he began to drive the Muslims out of France. And then it took 700 years to drive the Muslims out of Spain. And they were finally driven out by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, there at Granada. And so this is called the first wave of Islamic expansion. It went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean, and it was the largest empire in the world at the time, the Umayyad Muslim Empire. And then after they finished conquering, you know, there wasn't anybody else to fight, right? When they conquered the Christians and Jews, and so that's when they had a little more peaceful, right? Now, if you were a Christian and a Jew, originally, Muhammad would send a warrior to your walls of your city and say, we offer you peace. If you want peace, embrace Islam. And of course, if you didn't embrace Islam, that means you don't want peace, and they would fight. But after Jerusalem was able to hold them off for 3 months, and the Byzantine bishop goes to the walls of Jerusalem and finally surrenders, but he's able to swing an agreement. It's called the Pact of Omar, or the Covenant of Umar. And this allowed a third category, where those that surrender could agree to be a second-class citizen called a dhimmi, and they wouldn't be killed. And so the dhimmi could not pray out loud, they could not ring church bells, they If the Muslims destroy their churches, they cannot rebuild it. If the Muslims, and the dhimmi could not ride horses, the dhimmi could not own a weapon, the dhimmi could not have a meeting without a Muslim being present. If a Muslim walk in a room, the dhimmi has to stand up and give him the seat. And the dhimmi had to pay the annual jizya tax. You have to ransom your life once a year. And they would kneel down and take your money and grab your beard and slap your face, you know, and you had to be humiliated. And now, people say, well, what's a way to explain this? It's sort of the way the freed slaves were treated in the Deep South after the Civil War. Right? Lincoln, Republican, freed the slaves. The Democrats in the Deep South passed Jim Crow laws and black codes where the freed slaves were second-class citizens. They had to be in the back of the bus, you know, and they had to use different drinking fountains. They had to get up off the sidewalk if one of them was walking down the street. And if they didn't, they could expect vigilante justice, maybe a lynching. Terrible treatment, and that we repent of today. But this is the way Christians and Jews are treated today in Muslim countries. So if you and I were to go to Pakistan, you would be a dhimmi. And if you tried to convert somebody to your faith, you would be killed. It's the death penalty. If you said something like this speech that they would consider insulting to Islam, you would be killed. Right? And it's sort of interesting how I spoke on a military base, and the commander afterwards said, "This is fascinating. We're only taught that you're not supposed to insult Islam. We've never heard of the battles that Muhammad fought in." And I got a nice letter from the general afterwards saying, "You've made a tremendous impact on our command." And anyway, I said, you have to understand that when Muslims conquer a people, those people are forbidden to insult Islam. And so when you go in there and you're like really careful not to insult Islam, you're posturing yourself as the loser. It's sort of like crawling up on your knees to this guy saying, "I'm going to beat you." And they're like looking at thinking, "Okay, I hear your words, but you're acting like we've beaten you," you know. And then we do things like build mosques. I mean, here we're in debt, and we're having to pay taxes. Do you know that your kids are going in debt, and you're paying $770 million to rebuild mosques in 27 countries?
Yes.
Under Hillary Clinton's State Department, U.S. aid, and U.S. ambassadors fund for cultural preservation. And we're also teaching them how to get on the internet and so forth in these mosques. But matter of fact, one of the mosques, remember Amir ibn al-As, he's the general who conquered Egypt. I may have not mentioned his name yet, Amir ibn al-As. Well, right before he just started his war against the Christians in Egypt, Amir ibn al-As built a mosque. And over the centuries, it fell into disrepair. Some sewer lines broke in old Cairo and threatened it. And so you are rebuilding the Amir ibn al-As mosque. And just thought I'd let you know where your tax money is going. Here we have the Muslims seeing us, being afraid to offend them and rebuilding their mosques. And it's sort of like the jizya. I mean, the people they conquered back then had to pay this tax to them. So if you're not going to convert, you at least have to pay money so we can spread Islam to convert others. And so we're sort of buying this appeasement by giving them this money. Anyway, so the first wave of Islamic expansion under the rightly guided caliphs went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. After they had conquered this area and the Christians and Jews were made into these second-class citizens called dhimmi, they learned their place in society, they weren't uppity, then there was peace, right? And they bragged about how in Spain there was this golden age, but we all just tolerated each other. You know, I've read history, and you can read history about the Deep South, and you can read, you know, some Democrat guy that says, yeah, we got along with the blacks just fine, you know. I knew some growing up, we got along just fine. And then you read the history from the black perspective, and it's like, man, if we ever stepped out of line, we could be lynched, we could be mugged, we could be, and it's like they were always on thin ice. And so you read history from the Muslim perspective, and they said, Caliph, or you know, Sultan Mehmed II conquered, you know, spread Islam into Turkey, and he built these grand mosques, and he was tolerant of the infidels. Then you read the Christian, you know, the Jewish history is like, man, they would come in and they would kill, and they'd take our boys and force them to become Muslim soldiers and called janissaries, and if the boys were pretty, they went into the Muslim pederasty, their homosexual culture. You know, a man could have, Sultan could have 1,000 wives, and boys were just considered spoils of war. You know, they don't have a concept called homosexual. They just have this idea that they're super macho, and they can do it with lots of women, and they can do it with boys, and just about anything else. And so it's called the sodomy of the Turks. You didn't want your little boy taken by these, these Turkish Muslims. But anyway, so once the Christians and Jews learned how to fit in their senses, place in the society, there was this somewhat peace, right? And so some of these Muslim areas developed traditions of not being quite as violent because there wasn't anybody to fight. But because they developed traditions that weren't quite as violent, when the Mongolians converted to Islam, they were able to conquer the Persian and the Arab Muslims. So this is the beginning of the second wave of Islamic expansion. Genghis Khan, the Mongolian, conquers from Korea to Hungary and kills 30 million people. Genghis Khan has sons and grandsons, and one of his descendants, Tamerlane, converts to Islam and wants to spread it. But there was another one called Osman, and he started the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks, the Turkish Mongols. And so one of these Mongolian tribes converts to Islam, and this begins the second wave of Islamic expansion, the Turks. They conquer the Arab Muslims and the Persian Muslims, and then they invade the Byzantine Christian Empire, which is today Turkey and parts of the Middle East. And when they invade, the Byzantine Empire cries to the West for help. And the West sends help. It's called what? Crusades. Right? 9 major crusades in 200 years. So the Muslims first begin invading in 1071, Battle of Mezakert. And they would turn churches into mosques. I didn't mention in Egypt when the Muslims invaded, they would take the bones of the Christian saints and give them to the dogs. And Muhammad said, "Leave no high grave standing nor a work of art without obliterating it," because they considered them idols and so forth. So the Christians had to smuggle the bones of Saint Mark out of Egypt by packing them under pork, and they shipped them to Venice, Italy. If you've ever seen Venice, the gondolas in the background. There's this St. Mark's Cathedral with the pigeons flying around. That's where they put the bones of St. Mark. Anyway, well, when the Muslims invaded Turkey, the most popular Greek Orthodox saint was who? Saint Nicholas. Right? Lived during Roman times, was there at the Council of Nicaea, and slapped Arius across the face for starting the Arian heresy, and he tore down the temple to Diana, and Saint Nicholas was very generous and gave to the poor. And these Greeks would have a tradition on December 6th to give gifts on the anniversary of St. Nicholas's death. And when the Muslims invaded Turkey, and they would take the bones of the saints and give them to the dogs, the Christians moved the bones of St. Nicholas to Italy. A little town in southeast Italy called Bari, B-A-R-I. They built a cathedral there, Cattedrale Niccolò de Bari, Cathedral of Nicholas of Bari. The year was 1087. This introduces St. Nicholas to Western Europe, and it spreads. And since December 6th, the date of his death, is close to December 25th, it sort of got mixed in with Christmas, and then it was the Dutch immigrants that brought the traditions to New Amsterdam, which became New York, and they pronounced St. Nicholas Sant Niklaus, or Santa Claus. So we would not have a Santa Claus over here had it not been for a jihad over there. That would make for an interesting Christmas story. Hey kids, gather around. We're going to tell you another Christmas story. What's in it? Oh, no. Anyway, it's sort of funny. You don't mind me digressing just for a second. The Europeans had different traditions. In Holland, they have Bishop Nicholas, right? He's still dressed as the bishop, and he comes from Spain once a year, and he's riding a white horse, and he has with him a Moorish costumed helper, Zwarte Piet, Black Peter. And the kids in Holland are told that if they're good, St. Nicholas will give them presents. If they're naughty, Zwarte Piet will take them back to Spain and sell them into Muslim slavery. Oh my God. Because Spain was controlled by the Muslims for 700 years, and they captured tens of thousands and put them into slavery. And so often, when you would tell a little boy that St. Nicholas is coming, he'd start crying because he thought it might be his last night on earth. I was doing a radio interview, and a guy called in and said, "Yeah, I was raised over there, and every Christmas Eve, all the little boys would make sure to have pocket knives in their pockets." I said, "Why is that?" He goes, "Well, that's to cut ourselves out in the gunny sack in case Zwarte Piet took us." Anyway, so we have the first wave of Islamic expansion was Arab, and it went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. The second wave of Islamic expansion is Turkish, and it conquered the Arab and Persian world, and then it conquered the Byzantine Empire. And so the Byzantine emperor cries to the West for help, and the West sends help. It's called the Crusades. And you have to understand the dynamics of this. The Byzantine emperor was the head of the Byzantine Church, Greek Orthodox Church, and he viewed the Greek Orthodox Church as the true Christians. I mean, their land was where John spoke and Paul spoke. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were in Turkey. The Antioch, Colossae, Galatia, all these New Testament letters were written, half of them to cities that were in their land. And so they sort of viewed, hey, Christianity is our thing, and they view the Latin Catholic West as the church split. Matter of fact, the split happened in the year 1054, right before the Muslim invasion, and it happened over 2 words in the Nicene Creed, where the Byzantines say the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, and the Catholic West, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Now, as important as doctrinal issues are, this was, seemed relatively, minor compared to the Muslims who want to kill them all, And anyway, so the East and West split, and the Muslims invaded, so it was a big humbling of the Greek Orthodox pride to beg the church split from their estimation to come back and help them. And so Pope Urban II gets the message for help, and you read his letters. Fordham University has different letters that he had said, and he goes to the Council of Clermont and meets with these monarchs of Europe, and he says that the Saracen forces the Turk forces the Christians to extend their necks, and then they attempt with a single stroke of a naked sword to decapitate them. Like, yeah, that's what they do today, And anyway, so Europe responds and sends the First Crusade. And I don't know how I'm doing time-wise. I just ramble. Tell me if I should start wrapping it up. Should I keep talking? And so Pope Urban sends the First Crusade, Godfrey, and they take back Jerusalem for 100 years. Now, can we vouch for everything the Crusaders did? No. You take a young man and you give him a weapon, and you say, and so innocent people got killed. But you have to admit that the Crusades never would have happened had the Muslims not conquered these Christian areas, and these Christians begged for help, and they sent the help. So the First Crusade took back Jerusalem for 100 years. There were 9 major Crusades in 200 years. It basically saved Europe because it tied the Muslims up on their turf. Sort of like the Vietnam War slowed the communist expansion down, right, for a decade and lost its momentum. Well, the Muslims eventually did invade Europe, and they were barely turned back 4 centuries later. Had they had a free reign to attack Europe, Europe would have been like Egypt, right? It would have been conquered. So the Crusades did serve a purpose. Richard the Lionheart led the Third Crusade. We know him. He left his brother, King John, in charge of England. Remember taxes, Sherwood Forest, Nottingham, Robin Hood, and then later the Magna Carta. That was King John of England. And Richard the Lionheart led the Third Crusade. It was actually Frederick Barbarossa of Germany that was supposed to lead the crusade, and he was a tremendous guy, had this huge army, and they were going through Turkey, and his horse bucks as they pass over a shallow river, and he falls off with all his armor on and drowns in 2 feet of water. And so those troops were all confused, and Muslims began attacking and went back. So Richard was just supposed to play second fiddle in the crusade. Now he ends up being in charge of it. And it almost wins. Saladin in Jerusalem was propping dead Muslim soldiers up in the wall to make it look like, his soldiers are still alive. And then the King of France all of a sudden leaves the crusade, Philip, and goes back to France and begins to try to take over Normandy, which had belonged to the British. And so Richard's over there like fighting the crusade with half as many people as he was supposed to have, and Saladin still looks as strong as he was at the beginning, and now Philip's over there trying to take his land, so Richard just cuts a quick deal and leaves. And the deal was that Saladin would let the Christians go out of Jerusalem, and about 15,000 are let go, but there's about 8,000 that couldn't afford to pay their jizya, and they were sold into slavery. So it's sort of funny, you watch these movies and they try to portray Saladin as this really nice guy. He enslaved, 8,000 Christians. And then I lived in St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis was King Louis IX, the King of France, and he led the 7th and 8th Crusades against the Muslims. And he went to Egypt and was trying to save those Coptic Christians in Egypt. And wins a couple battles, and then he's lured into Egypt a little further, and the rains were really bad, and the rivers, the Nile was up at its banks, and somebody breaks the levee, and the floods come in and floods his army, and so he loses that crusade. And anyway, finally the Crusades end, and the Muslims now can pick up where they left off, invading Europe. And in the year 1453, the Muslims finally captured Constantinople, which was the capital of the world. It was the New York, Washington, D.C. I mean, this is where Constantine had moved the capital of Rome to where the Black Sea empties into the Mediterranean. This is where the East and the West met. And when Rome fell to the Visigoths in 476 AD, Constantinople lasted another 1,000 years. They had this invincibility complex. They thought they were God's special city. I mean, they were all Christian, they had churches everywhere, you know, and when the Attila the Hun, these other ones conquered Western Europe, they were able to survive. They had these 3-tiered walls around the city. They had the largest church in Christendom for 1,000 years. Hagia Sophia. Muslims turned it into a mosque and covered up 4 acres of gold mosaics with Quran verses. Anyway, so finally in 1453, the Muslims conquered Constantinople. Mehmet II was the Sultan. He had taken the church bells from these Byzantine churches he had conquered and melted them into cannons. And he didn't know how to make cannons, and so there was this, you know, Hungarian cannon maker named Urban who offered his services to Constantinople, but they couldn't afford to pay him, so he defects and he works for the Sultan. And shows him how to make these. He makes the largest cannon in the world. One of them is 27 feet long. It could shoot a 1,200-pound stone cannonball over a mile. And anyway, can't help but see the analogy of these Russian nuclear scientists that couldn't afford to be paid in Russia, and they defect and they go to Iran and they help Mahmoud Ahmadinejad build the biggest cannons in the world, but instead of gunpowder, it's nuclear power. And just to show you, there were Genoan and Venetian merchants who were selling military goods to the Muslims that they knew were going to be used against the Byzantine Christians, but they just wanted a buck. Sort of like today, you know, of all the Sharia finance, and I mean, here we are, you know, instead of drilling for oil in our, you know, Gulf or Alaska, we have these, you know, we're doing business and giving them all the money, and you know, so when Constantinople falls in 1453, this ended land trade between Western Europe and India and China. People forget Europe traded with India and China for centuries. The Roman Empire crossed over the Parthian Empire, which was left over from Alexander the Great, crossed over the Kushan Indian Empire, crossed over to the Han Empire in China. I mean, the 1st century. And Marco Polo was a Venetian merchant, and in 1271 he went from Venice, Italy to China and worked for Kublai Khan for 24 years. And Marco Polo brought back spaghetti, coal, these burning rocks, talked about Kublai Khan inventing paper currency. And then Kublai Khan like printed too much of it, and the whole thing then eventually crumbled, you know. And talked about they had these plates that were not made out of metal or wood; they were made out of China. We still call it China to this day because that's where it came from. The Chinese had thread from worms, silkworms. I mean, the Chinese were technologically superior, and so this trade went on until the Muslims attacked the caravans and wiped out you know, all of Central Asia. I mean, there was thriving Christian communities there, you know, along the China Silk Road. And then they conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending land trade between Europe and India and China over the land. The year again, I repeat, is 1453. What happened about 40 years later? Columbus. And where was Columbus trying to get to? India and China. Right? He was carrying a letter out from the King and Queen of Spain to the Grand Khan, like Kublai Khan. He was wandering around Cuba with this letter to the Grand Khan. He thought he was going over to open up trade with India and China. And he wanted to evangelize them too, because Kublai Khan asked for 100 teachers of the Christian faith, and the Pope had never sent them, so Columbus thought, well, hey, I'll help evangelize. And so Columbus met some natives, and he thought he was in India, so he named the natives Indians. We would not call Native Americans Indians if it had not been for jihad cutting off the land routes to India and China. Imagine that. All the Indiana, we even have a state name. We would not call the state Indiana.